Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our bi-weekly meeting, the first one that is on Thursday. Today is the 1st of June, 2023. We had some technical problems trying to start the recording, but I think now it's working. Ashley, I think you are the first person on our agenda, so please go ahead and explain what you want to talk about.
Thanks. It's hopefully a really quick thing. I just wanted to sort of check for consensus on it. So I put a link to this cert-manager Artifact Hub page, which you'll go to if you go to our organization on Artifact Hub. This is at least somewhat popular. Cert-manager has 441 stars on Artifact Hub, so people do use this website. Like they discover things through here. That link is this one. If you go on that now, the top three entries are cert-manager Trust, and Trust Manager. Cert-manager Trust being the old name for Trust Manager. They're ordered in the number of stars that they have. So cert-manager Trust actually had 3 stars before today, whereas Trust Manager only had 2. So I've started that to bump it up. But essentially, nobody should be installing the cert-manager Trust one. We want to stop them from doing that. It's just kind of been looked over as we did the rename, and I would like to do something about it to stop it from being a point of confusion for people. I also don't want to break people aggressively, like if they want to keep on using that name for the next release, whatever, that's fine. But my proposal would essentially be to soon release a new Trust Manager version that might be in part inspired by what Irbe is doing in this PR, which I've just reviewed actually. There's a few changes here. It fixes a CVE, so it's worth doing a point release for it. Like it should work exactly the same, so there's no functional changes. But the proposal is to do that release and then to create a branch off that release, changing the Helm chart that we have in the repo to match what's in cert-manager Trust. Update that, add a massive warning when you install it that it won't ever be updated again. Add a massive warning in the README that it won't ever be updated again. Just generally make it super obvious that this is the last ever thing we'll publish to cert-manager Trust and you shouldn't be using it. The reason for doing that in a branch is just so people can see the changes that I make if I do that. I don't want to... Ideally, that would be a thing that people can always audit what's happened. I could just create a manual entry in the Helm chart repo that we currently have just for cert-manager Trust and do it manually there. Like generate the chart locally and then do it like that. But I think it would be better to be auditable. That was my suggestion. Does anyone have any comments or improvements or anything, Tim?
I think I agree with what you said. Just for your information, I worked on this in the past, but my approach was different and it didn't work. So I think your approach will work. But my approach was basically, I thought that we could just update the index of the Helm chart repository. And in there is a field that says like deprecated. And that's something you should do too, I think. Like Helm has this notion of a deprecated chart, basically. So you can set that field to true, and normally that should also trigger something in the UI, I think, in what's it called, Artifact Hub. So I tried to do that. So my story is I tried to do that in the index only and not in the chart itself, and that didn't do it for me. Like you have to do it in the chart itself. I didn't do that ultimately because that would mean that I would have to change the existing chart, and didn't want to do that. But like releasing a new version, I think makes sense. But I hope that it doesn't then do some smart thinking or logic and then refer to the older version of that same Helm thing. So I'm not sure about that.
That would be frustrating if that happened, but I didn't know about the deprecated field, but I'll definitely use that. So the index, as I remember, is generated from the charts that exist. So it makes sense to me that the index change wouldn't have worked, but we can easily have a fork, not a branch that has these changes and makes it clear. I think. Irbe?
I maybe didn't fully understand, like, what is the main thing that we want to achieve? Do we want to help people who have currently installed like cert-manager, trust manager, like the old chart, to understand that is the main thing to help them to understand that the successor of that is trust manager?
Yeah, at the moment it's not clear that it won't ever be updated again. Like the old chart just exists and is currently visible right next to trust manager, so it's hard to know which one is actually supposed to be used. It's to make it clear to users which one they should use, and at the point of install for cert-manager trust to make it clear that they shouldn't be using it. But one potential thing could be to go back and change the old charts and add in a deprecated thing there. But I suspect that would break some cache somewhere and look suspicious, so I'm not particularly keen on the idea of doing that.
So the best would be if there was some kind of note, because even if you like mark it as deprecated, they won't necessarily understand that trust manager is what they're supposed to be using now.
My intention was to add a notes.txt, which will print in the console when someone installs from that old chart, saying this is deprecated, don't use it.
And so your concern is that if you release a new chart like that, it will break some people who are, I don't know, installing latest always and are just relying that it works, something like that. Like, what's the worst that could happen?
When you say releasing a chart like that, what do you mean? Sorry.
I thought okay, maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were planning to release a new version. I'm wrong, right? You're not planning to release a new cert-manager, trust manager.
Yeah, I am. That's exactly what I'm proposing, yeah.
But it would be non-functional, would just like print the error, or it would be functional.
No, it would be Trust Manager 0.5.1. It'd be the exact same code and everything. But when you install the Helm chart, it would say, right, this is an error. Because otherwise it's just like a needless break, like, for people.
But suppose they currently have installed and they will upgrade. Will the upgrade even work? Is it going to just like randomly break their cluster setup?
We haven't made any breaking changes since then, so
I don't know. I have no idea.
No, yeah, it shouldn't. It should all just work. Like, I think you should be able to upgrade from version 0.2, which was the last trust release we did, to 0.5, which is the latest trust manager. I think that should work fine.
But why do you even bother actually like updating to 0.5? Why not just cut a new? Is it not possible to make a new chart that literally just is the same as the old chart but just prints the error?
I mean, it's possible, but then like that forcibly breaks people, right? If they are intentionally installing the latest release, they will, like, it's been working just fine for 10 months for them, and overnight it will just break and it will leave a bad taste in the mouth. Like, we can sort of give them a bit of sugar and say, hey, here's the latest version, but you really need to upgrade because you won't get another one. Like, it's a carrot on a stick.
I'm not sure. Like, Irbe was proposing to re-release the latest version that we have for that repo, right? For that name. So cert-manager trust, like the latest version there is 0.2.
Oh, right, branch it way back and
Yeah.
then do it. Oh.
Actually, I didn't fully understand the last thing that you said, because when you said they are still using it with that name, the newest that they can use that way is 0.2, right? They can't use 0.4 in that way.
Yeah.
So then what did you mean when you said break them or something?
If we push a non-functional version and they install the latest version of that old name.
Oh, I didn't mean non-functional. I thought that my understanding was that the original proposal was to release 0.5 in that old repo. What I was suggesting that we just re-release the same 0.2, but with a warning.
That works also. Yeah, I don't really care. I just want it to not look silly on Artifact Hub. Like my instinct is give them something nice, and then they've got a reason to upgrade, and then notice it. But I don't really mind. Like I can go back and fork at a very old time. Like the part of the problem there is that all of like the build process has changed a bit since then, so there's going to maybe be a bit of manual finagling to get a release done, but it shouldn't be too hard. Oh, and actually another potential issue is that the version numbers would then diverge, right? Like there'd be a 0.2.1 released on the old version, which would never have existed in the new Trust Manager chart.
I feel like that's okay. I wonder whether we can do this without using the build pipeline, like just taking the old chart and like manually editing the files, like the README and the notes and so on.
It's a new chart version and not a new app version. Yeah, that does make sense. Oh, whatever. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That makes sense. Like it's hopefully about the same amount of work, so it's worth a go, I guess.
I think it might be a bit safer than releasing this new version, because there is quite a significant version jump then, right? From 0.2 to 0.5.
Potentially, yeah.
Normally we say like only update one version at a time.
Yeah, I don't care, so I'll just do the old one.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess the three things are notes when you install it, also the README, so that on the Artifact Hub it shows it clearly, and then also the deprecated field, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure that that is actually a useful field or not.
Yeah, those were the things I was going to change.
The three things. Okay, cool. I think we fully discussed this, right?
Yeah, more than it's worth. So let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, next thing is the issuer library. So in the meeting notes, you can find the link to the issuer library repository and the pull requests where it was initially created, or the initial code was added to the repository. Basically, the idea is the basic, fundamentally, the challenge that we saw is that a lot of these issuers that we create have a lot of boilerplate code that is common across issuers. So if you look at the Google CAS issuer that Jetstack developed, if you look at the Amazon private CA issuer that is in the cert-manager repository, there are a couple few more issuers, also the example or the sample external issuer. All those have a lot of logic that is in common. And the question that we ask ourselves is it possible to kind of deduplicate all that logic and put it in a library? And that is where this issuer library comes from. Initially, this was developed at Venafi Jetstack. But we at Venafi, we saw that this has great potential for open source too. It can greatly simplify some of the open source issuers that exist. And that's why we open sourced it and basically donated it to cert-manager itself. There are still some warnings. So let's say, don't start using it right away. First, read the warnings in the README. Most of the warnings are about stability. I think this is a library that still is a work in progress. like it is used already in production, but the interface and so on, it's still subject to change in the future, definitely. There are still features that we would like to add and that we know will require some changes in the API and so on. So be a bit, how do you say that? Be cautious about this when you start to use it. And first read the README, there it explains it well, when you should use it, and also what the process is in terms of maturity of the project. So simply put, the idea is all the common logic is put in this library. It makes it much easier to create an issuer, a cert-manager issuer. You just have to implement two functions, a sign function and check function. The check function checks whether your CA is actually available, and the sign function takes a certificate request, signs the certificate request, and returns the signed certificate. Then the controller now receives the signed certificate from the sign function and then puts it in the status, gives it to cert-manager, so cert-manager can continue doing what it should do with that certificate. So that's the short explanation. More information can also be found in the README. I'll link it in the chat here, the library. I hope this is also added to the recording. But yeah. Okay. Do you want me to screen share the codes, Irbe? Or am I missing something? Maybe an old comment.
Yeah, like I felt like maybe it would have been interesting if you had like briefly walked through how it's used.
Okay, I can do that
if we have time.
We have time.
Do you mean with the sample that you have in the repository, maybe? Is that
Okay.
what you mean, Irbe?
I haven't looked at the code, so I don't really know what it does.
All right.
Okay.
As in I have, but I haven't like properly looked at it.
All right, so this is the repository. Here you have the disclaimer that you should definitely read. We have some of the goals listed here. It was all added today, so it's pretty new still. Here in the usages section, it shows you where you can find an example. In the future, I think we should also move the sample external issuer to use this library, so that it's a bit easier to get started with this. But now this simple setup can be used. And basically this is how what your issue would look like. So you have the API, where you define your issuer types, and these issuer types, they implement this issuer interface, which comes from the issuer library. And then you can use those types in your controllers. Then if you look at the controls themselves, they're pretty basic. So you import these controllers. This combined controller, you import it from issuer library 2. And in here, you provide your issuer resources, which implement this issuer type, this issuer interface. So you specify the issuer types and the cluster issuer types, and then provide some other information. And basically, that's it. So this is the sign and the check function. Here you have all the business logic that is important to you. This simple issuer has no check, so it will always be considered ready, the issuers, which is it's a very simple implementation, like the name it says. And then the sign function just, I think, signs it with a randomly generated CA. So it's a very simple implementation, but it gives you an idea of what your control can look like, and it's pretty simple. So this one file actually contains all the business logic for your issuer, and all the other stuff is like API, setting up like a reading flags, creating the controller and so on, calling everything. So it's pretty simple, like testing and so on. But that's it, basically. A very simple example.
Okay, I guess I need to look more at like how it's actually used. I suppose like controller, like for example, for controller setup, that isn't really functionality that you can import, right? Because you would want to set up your own watches, like whatever your resources you want to watch and things like that. Or is this meant to be imported?
It's meant to be imported, yes. So the watches, most watches are set up already for like the issuer itself. Like all the watches for the issuers and the certificate requests are set up automatically for you. What you can do is you can add actually additional watches. For example, if you in your issuer refer to a secret where you read some kind of credential, then you want to make sure that the issuer is also reconciled when the secret changes, right? So therefore, you need an additional watch. And there is, it's not used here, but there is a field that's called post setup with manager, and there you basically can add additional watches to your controller, I think. That needs a bit more of an example here, but it is used that way already in some other projects.
Cool. And I guess like for the sign and check, people just implement the interface, right? They implement their own sign and check. So what it gives is just to run those in the reconcile loop. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm not sure what do you mean with they implemented in their own interface?
Like there isn't, for example, like that function on line 66, is it just an example or is it like, yeah, that's an example. Okay, I can see the path now. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this whole file is an example basically. So what you do is you copy this, like what's in this directory, you copy all this into your own repository if you want to experiment with this. That's how you get started basically. But what you do import is this combined controller, and you get you start from there, from that point. You provide the combined controller with the sign function and this check function, and these contain your business logic.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess like what I wanted is like the TLDR of what functionality is actually being imported. Like, what's the bits that you don't have to do when you use this?
So I guess it's kind of explained here in goals. Here, like in how it works, it's explained in great detail because there's also quite a bit of complex logic in terms of error handling, which can maybe be simplified still in the future. Like in TLDR terms, the idea is that we set up the watches for certificate request and all the issuer types. Then we do the check function on the issuer. So we update the issuer status condition with whether the issuer is ready or not. And all the certificate requests that are linked to that issuer actually wait for the issuer to become ready. At the same time, so after it is ready, we check basically so for the approval and denial of certificate requests, and we handle those cases correctly. And then we also update, after we call the sign function, we update the certificate request status with the signed certificate data. That's basically the gist of it. But there's a lot of error and retry logic in there too.
Yeah. I've been reviewing it. There's a large part of the complexity that comes from the proper way of handling shutdown of the issue of the controller, and you can look into. There are a few coroutines running over there, right? Is it? I don't remember.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but like one thing, for example, with these check functions is check should keep checking, right? So it, like if there's an error, it should retry. It should do that indefinitely, because at some point there might be the CA might be available again. But then there are also certain checks, certain errors that could be permanent, because maybe like a field is set incorrectly, so that you know this configuration will never work, also not in the future. So then you return a permanent error. That basically means that the this resource won't be reconciled again before there is an update to the issuer resource. That makes sense. So you wait basically for update to issuer resource, otherwise like there's exponential backoff. And kind of the same logic also is for the sign function, but there's also max duration, max retry duration, which basically limits the amount of time that you can retry signing the certificate request, because at some point you want the certificate request to fail, so that the failed status of the certificate request is also reflected in the certificate resource. So there is some logic there too. And then some additional logic there is that if you have an error in the sign function, that should actually have been picked up in the check function, you return this issuer error. And this can, for example, be the case when you have a client that you set up, like let's say you make a connection to your CA and you use credentials for that. You log in to your CA in the check function. And then in the sign function, you see, well, actually, these credentials aren't valid anymore. It's a bit weird to only reflect this in the certificate request resource, because you know that this doesn't depend on the certificate request resource. It's actually an error that's specific to the issuer itself. So now you throw an issuer error, which will basically update the issuer and put the issuer in a failed status instead of the certificate request only. So we'll put in the failed status.
This is a massive, step forward. This is a great feature. This should be the selling point of this control. It's really tricky to do this, like update both the certificate request and the issuer, like an external resource, external to the reconciliation loop. There is a ton of logic to deal with this. So I think we should make it really clear that thanks to this library, you will be able to bubble up the error to the issuer resource, which is much more useful than just having it on the certificate request. Although it's not mandatory to do so, but I think it's a great feature. Although it comes with a cost, cost of the complexity.
But that's I think it can be more like this library can be marginally more complex than how we implemented the issuers separately, because it is a library, right? So it kind of hides a bit of the complexity behind all the abstractions that you have. So but we still I'm convinced that we still have to consider all the trade-offs that we make, and I'm definitely not saying that this is 100% the way it should be. I think we should still reconsider some of these things and think about how to make it simpler, and whether everything that we have, all the logic we have, is actually valuable.
I think we all approve or we accept the donation, right? There's no question on this, I'm assuming. So, oh, Josh. Hey, Josh.
Hi.
Nice background.
Hello. Thanks.
Yeah, we were this.
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
Tim was presenting his issuer-lib, and I was saying that we would adopt it, or we would accept it as a donated project to the cert-manager project.
Basically, I was explaining what's in the README, honestly. So if you want to see all that, please rewatch the recording, because we recorded all of it. But I can give you a small two-log dinner. Basically, first of all, read the README. There is a disclaimer in there that says what you can expect in terms of stability. That I think that's pretty important. That's something we were discussing. And it also outlines what the different steps are that we see in terms of how we can make this project more mature in the future. Then the README also states some goals. Ultimately, the idea is that you can build a new issuer pretty easily using this library. You just import it, and then it should be so that all the logic that you implement on top of this library should all be specific to your use case. So it should be business logic, basically. And you shouldn't have to deal much with setting the right conditions when your certificate request is was denied or approved or so on. So you shouldn't actually worry about that, because that's actually logic that's common across all the issuers that we have. And then there's also this example, which I showcased a bit. And now I was talking about some of the error handling, which is a pretty big chunk of what's in this library, basically. And we were also talking about complexity and the fact that this, like, in terms of stability, is also important. It's still up to debate some of these things, like whether we want to have the error handling the way it is. This is pretty complete right now, but it might be a bit complex, maybe. That's what we were discussing.
Cool. Thanks for having me in. Sorry I'm late. I had some Dapr stuff I had to go to, but better late than never.
So are there any other questions here?
I have a couple of questions. For the first bit, the stability disclaimer, how did you come up with the milestones, or were they just kind of like semi-arbitrary and kind of just rough guesses? Or yeah, what's the story there?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think like the first step is something that we see as something that we should do. We have this Google CAS issue, I think, that we want to move to this library. We have the sample external issue that we want to try to move to this library. But after that, I think the numbers are pretty arbitrarily chosen. But we still want to do that, since that gives us some power to say, okay, well, we actually want to move on with this library, right? We don't want to get in a situation where cert-manager has these alpha feature gates that are never graduated to beta, because there are like very loosely defined objective or like requirements. So that's kind of why I chose these. But these are also still, these can be changed still in the future, I think.
Cool. Okay. The other one was, why is this a separate repository or library to the example issuer? Like, why not just put them in the same thing? Because like, I'd assume the example issuer is just an example directory of this repo. I would have thought, you know. So why don't we do that? If we're happy to go ahead with this, which it sounds like there is at least a majority consensus to do that. Why should we do that? And if we do want to do that, we should do that sooner rather than later, i.e. now, because Go imports come a pain.
Yeah, so that is indeed an option, I think. But the idea would be like it would be a bit different. I think we would just have an example folder here, and then everything what's in sample external issuer would be in that example folder. So it would basically mean that we deprecate sample external issuer, I would say. Because this is a library and sample external issuer is more of a templates project, right? And in that sense, it might still be useful to have it, since you could just clone the repository and kind of start from there. With like, it's a small difference, right? But if you have an example folder, you still have to move all the files out and so on.
Yeah, I think so. That makes sense. Is there like some functionality in GitHub where you can create like a repo template? I swear I've seen that before. Have I dreamt that?
Yeah, I think it exists.
Forking?
Pardon?
No, there's like a template thing.
No, like an actual like a dedicated first class feature for a template. Yeah, I think I just saw it. Saw the word template anyway. Scroll up. Okay. Set templates. What's that mean? Yeah.
I'm not sure what
so it's
the
not
intent
forking.
is.
Go ahead, Irbe.
I was going to say, if it's at the moment, we don't yet recommend people using it. So if we were to put it into sample external issuer, we'll probably have to change the sample external issuer framework as well to work with this. So that probably, because the sample external issuer is how we currently recommend, like the stable way, how we currently recommend creating issuers, whereas this is still relatively alpha. So I don't think we have a way how to put this into a sample external issuer without changing the actual current, like, the framework there, and kind of like, communicating to people that there's like one way that's relatively stable and one that's still more experimental.
I agree. Yeah.
Cool. Makes sense. So basically keep this unreleased effectively, or alpha release it until we're happy with its kind of maturity, and then we can do the whole rigmarole of refactoring the sample one, maybe even making that into a GitHub template if that's interesting for us. But we still want to keep it. Well, we can make that decision later.
I think the Google Cache issue we can migrate without much trouble, because that's one that we as Venafi maintain. So we're only breaking ourselves if we choose this library. So that's like, it shouldn't break someone else. That's what I'm saying.
So you are saying that you are confident in its correctness, but you're not comfortable in its API stability. It's basically the state of the project.
Yes.
But I think like what we said was also that, despite the fact that, I mean, we had a discussion about this in the stand-up, and what was being said was, despite the fact that we don't know what obvious errors there are, we can't quite say that it's production ready when it's actually, that the library is production ready when it's actually not used by a properly production ready open source project.
Well, I think that term is pretty meaningless anyway, to be honest. Like, I think we can come up with our own definition. It's very kind of, yeah.
So maybe one example I would like to give is if we want to support Kubernetes CSRs if we want to support signing those, issuing those, then that will require a change in the API. That's pretty clear because right now we pass the certificate request to the sign function. That wouldn't be possible if it's a certificate, if it's not a certificate request, but a Kubernetes CSR. So there is, like, if we want to do that, it's definitely breaking change necessary there in terms of Go API. Are there any other questions, remarks, things that we have to consider?
It looks really good. I'm excited. Good job.
Yeah, good job. Also, extremely well tested from my perspective.
Well explained today as well. Well done. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. I have one more topic here, and it's a bit, actually two topics. Maybe, Maël, you do your topic, and I'll move my topic to next week or next 2 weeks.
Okay.
I don't think we have in 9 minutes. We can't talk about governance, can we?
No. It's just a heads up. It's just it's not. We're not going to discuss it and everything because I haven't given any time to anyone to think about it. So it's really unfair to talk about this. But here is it's coming to us. Governance is just a document where we define who are the maintainers and how we define maintainers, how we define a steering committee. So for the maintainers, it is quite easy. The only thing we need to work on is how can someone become a maintainer? And the second thing is the steering committee. It cannot be us, at least not me, because I don't have any stakes in cert-manager, and I don't think any of us, or maybe someone, does anyone here have a big deployment of cert-manager? Critical one.
As an end user.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I mean,
So
you could
that would
argue
be,
that if you deploy it for your customers, you have a lot of deployments, right?
yeah, but that would be the customers. Like they would be the stakeholder, not us. We would be the vendor, let's say. So that's why the steering committee is a bit different from the maintainership group. Yeah. So I will be at some point proposing something, and I'll be probably copy pasting some other document from someone else, like Linkerd, and we can discuss that probably in the next biweekly, hopefully. And that would mean it's one of the things we need to do for graduation. That's it. That was my heads up.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'm super happy that you want to do this and want to put some effort in this. I think it's very necessary for our project to make the next step.
Yeah, and what's funny is we don't have this round of people that keep the feedback coming to the maintainers. We kind of live in a closed circle right now, so that's what I wish to see. I wish to see more decisions being balanced between maintainers and the steering committee. Although we don't want to have the steering committee thing meeting happening all the time. It can be on a ad hoc basis, no problem. But still, and I can see a few of our big users who could be become members of this. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you explain to me the responsibilities of a steering committee person, how they're different from the maintainers, and how their motivation would be different from the maintainer? Struggling to see what difference there is there.
So they represent the end user, or yeah, they represent the end user. That's the key thing. And I will be reading the membership or responsibilities list that is on the Linkerd page, because I cannot be bothered. Provide feedback to maintainers, assist maintainers in prioritizing roadmap, represent the voice of the end user, provide neutral mediation for non-technical disputes, which I don't really know what this is about. And finally, maintain a project continuity plan. So it's making sure the people who use the project have some way of being represented, because the problem with maintainers, at least for Kubernetes projects, is that it's mainly vendors that are represented in the maintainers. It's rarely the end users. So the ones that have a big stake in cert-manager will be able to influence in some way the decision, some of the decisions. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Do you have examples of Linkerd who is in the steering committee, for example?
Sorry, example of people in
Yeah,
the
it's
Linkerd
like
project.
I'm not interested in the person themselves. I'm interested in like what company do they represent.
Sure.
And
So in the initial steering committee, so the steering committee for Linkerd has 7 seats. There are, initially they only had 4 people on the steering committee. So the first one is from HP, second one Finlip Connect, third one HEB, which I don't know anything about this, and the fourth one is Subspace.
so the idea is that they are
yeah.
all different from the Linkerd parent company, right? Is that the idea?
Yes, or it's not parent company. The problem is the Linkerd parent company does not have stakes in, or they do have stakes, but not the end user stakes. Like they do want to sell it at some point. So they are considered as a vendor. It's like us, the same. So we're trying, with the steering committee, we're trying, I'm assuming that this is what we're trying to do. I'm hoping that someone can help me clarify this.
But it's like the responsibility of CNCF, or is it our responsibility to ensure that it's well balanced? Because like I imagine that one of the things is that you want it to be balanced. You don't want the 7 people to be from one company or from 2 companies that want like specific type of changes that would actually be less desirable by a large section of other users, for example. Which is one thing that I'm interested in. Another thing is, do people apply to this or do they get invited?
Yeah, so the voting system is apparently something, so there's a vote happening between the existing steering committee members and the maintainers. It doesn't feel like very democratic, but it doesn't matter. It needs to be done. And on the topic of which companies should be represented or how many people from each company, the only thing that I know is the CNCF graduation requires us to have at least 4 stakeholders. I think 4 is the requirement, and that's probably why Linkerd has 4, only 4.
But I mean, what stakeholders? Do you mean steering committee or?
Sorry, it's a very poor word. I shouldn't. End user in the steering committee.
But like, for example, Diagrid is also an end user, I think, right?
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
And George is a maintainer, so is that like, that's not a problem, right? George could be in the steering committee. Is that correct?
Do you maintain personally a cert-manager deployment that is large?
Not me personally, but we will at some point. Hopefully, it'll be big. Things go well.
So yeah, you could definitely.
It wouldn't be
apply,
appropriate. I don't think it'd be
assume.
appropriate for me personally to be on the steering committee, right? That just doesn't. I don't think that makes.
Does it
much
have to be
sense.
large or just production level usage?
Production would be better.
I assume VMware probably has something. They joined already a lot of our meetings.
Yeah, we have many people on the cert-manager channel that have these large deployments, so we could just reach out to them and ask them or invite them somehow.
And what are their tasks that they have to perform?
So the responsibilities that I mentioned, and that translates into being in the meetings when they are invited. And these steering committee meetings don't happen very often. It's on a need basis. It depends on the need, and that's pretty much it. They're just representing. So it's not a high effort. Did I answer all the questions? Do we? No? Yeah. Okay, great.
Is there anything
So
else you want to talk about still?
No,
I'll
I'll keep you updated.
stop the recording.